to our first Challenger Summer Blast Pack. I am Commander Melissa, and we are so glad that you are here today. We miss seeing all of you at the Challenger Learning Center, but we are excited that you are able to do our Blast Packs with us. Well, today we're going to start with the Blast Pack, Space Food. Have you ever wondered what it's like to eat in space? Let's find out. All right, let's get started. But before we do our experiments, let's talk about a little bit of history of space flight and space food. Alan Shepard was the first American astronaut to go to space. He went to space on May 5th, 1961. His flight was what we call suborbital. All he did was launch, he came up, and he came back down and splashed into the ocean. He didn't orbit the Earth, and his flight was only about 15 minutes. So he really didn't need to worry about eating or drinking while he was in space. The first person to eat in space was John Glenn. And John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. And he was the third astronaut to go to space. Now, John Glenn's flight was orbital, which meant he orbited the Earth 3 times. And so John had to eat a little bit while he was up in space. And here's a picture of him eating applesauce. Now, when John Glenn was going to space, the scientists at NASA and the doctors and the flight surgeons and the nutritionists were all worried about problems that John Glenn might encounter in space while eating, including swallowing. What if in the microgravity environment, he swallowed his food and then it came right back up? They just didn't know what was going to happen. So they made John Glenn food in little bite-sized cubes. They gave him some freeze-dried foods, and they even gave him semi-liquid foods, kind of like baby food, in toothpaste tubes. Well, they kept eating that on the Mercury flights, but then we progressed to the Gemini program. And you may recognize the word Gemini or Gemini, and that means twins. And so there were 2 astronauts on board the Gemini flights. Now, the Gemini flights were a lot longer, and so NASA added more food variety and better packaging than they had during the Mercury program. They even started to send dehydrated food that the astronauts could inject liquid into the package to rehydrate it or put the liquid back into it. Now, because the astronauts were up in space for a lot longer, sometimes close to 10 days, the nutritionists had to start thinking about making sure the astronauts ate enough food and got enough vitamins and enough nutrients to keep them healthy while they were in space. Well, after Mercury and Gemini, then came the Apollo program. And of course, we all know the Apollo program is what took us to the moon. Now, in the Apollo program, we had learned a lot about food in space from Mercury and Gemini. But new foods were introduced during the Apollo program, like coffee, bacon, cornflakes, scrambled eggs, cheese crackers, and even chocolate pudding, peanut butter, spaghetti, and hot dogs. Even something called a spoon bowl package was introduced. So the astronauts wouldn't just have to slurp their food. They could use a spoon to eat out of a package. All right, let's talk about the space shuttle era. The first space shuttle launched in 1981 and retired in 2011. We learned a lot from all the historical programs about food. So food for the space shuttle had come a long way. And today, we use that same science for flights to the International Space Station and for the launch that you may have just watched a couple of weeks ago, the Dragon Demo 2 launch that went to the International Space Station. So, the space shuttle food, more Earth-like food was used just to help the astronauts feel more at home. The astronauts were spending a lot of time on the space station, and they didn't want them to get tired of the same old food. So 74 different kinds of food and 20 different kinds of beverages are available on the astronaut menu. The astronauts get to pick their food ahead of time, and they pick their menu for their entire trip. Now, the nutritionists make sure that they're eating healthy, and they get a variety of food and get a variety of minerals and vitamins and what they need from their food. Now, the food on the space shuttle was stored and eaten from food trays. And when we're talking about spaceflight now, the weight of food matters, because the more weight you have in food, the less weight you'll have to take up other things like science experiments and other supplies that you might need. So the food and beverage containers during the space shuttle era were improved a lot, especially for the longer duration flights. Now, let's talk about the types of space food. And I've got different types of space food right here in my bin. A lot of these have actually flown to space. They were just leftovers, and so we were lucky enough to get them. Some of them are getting pretty old, but they still give you an idea of what kind of food that we have in space. So one of the main foods is called rehydratable food. In other words, it's food that the liquid has been taken out of. For instance, this, chicken and rice. And you can see that. And when I bang it, it's hard. There's no liquid in this. But you can see this little tube right here. And on board the space station, there's a machine that injects water into this. There's a cold water injection and a warm water injection. And of course, with chicken and rice, we want to put in warm water. And our recipe says add, I think it says 700 milliliters of warm water and let it sit for a while. And then it's ready to eat. Now, another one you might like, and this is probably one of everybody's favorites, is, of course, macaroni and cheese. Of course, can you hear how hard that is? That's harder than any macaroni and cheese I've ever eaten. But again, the recipe says 125 milliliters of hot water and let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes, and you will rehydrate your macaroni and cheese. Now, another kind of food is called thermostabilized food. That's a big word. Thermostabilized, and it's processed so that it can be stored at room temperature. And this might include things like fruit and tuna fish and things that we might normally have in cans. So for instance, this food right here is actually sugar snap peas. And so you would warm that up in a little convection type oven, and then you would cut it open and you would eat your peas out of that bag. Now, we can take intermediate moisture food. It's food that has just a little bit of moisture in it. I don't have any actual examples of that in my box, but it's food that hasn't been totally hydrated, but it takes the moisture out a little bit so it weighs a little less and it stays a little fresher. You can set up natural form food. It just has to be packaged differently. For instance, these are crackers. You wouldn't want to just take up a box of crackers because if you opened it and then they would float away. But here are 4 crackers that you could cut open and snack on. And we've got some trail mix in here. There's some banana chips and peanuts and different things in there. So that is a form of natural form food. So one of the less common foods we have in space is called irradiated food. For instance, it might be meat like beef steak or turkey that has been cooked and put in special foil pouches. And then those foil pouches have been sterilized with ionizing radiation, and they can be kept at room temperature. Because remember, there's no refrigerator on board the ISS or any of the space vehicles that we use to take to the ISS. So not only do we have to eat in space, we have to drink in space. Now, I know a lot of us like to drink soda, and a lot of us have also heard of Tang. Well, Tang is known to be a popular space drink, but Tang was around a long time before the astronauts used it in space. And Tang became more popular when it was taken to the moon on the Apollo missions in the 1960s. So you're going to make a little astronaut drink bag with your Tang. And so your kit has a little thing of Tang in it. So Tang has been around since the 1950s, but again, it became very popular because of space travel. A lot of people think that NASA invented Tang, but they actually didn't. They just used it. Now let's talk about how NASA used that Tang, or used powdered drinks. So this is a drink pouch that an astronaut would use, and it probably reminds you of something that you drink quite often. And I have one of those in here, a Capri Sun. It's actually made from the same material that a Capri Sun pouch is made from. Capri Sun actually makes these for NASA. But the biggest difference is you notice a regular Capri Sun has liquid in it, and this space drink does not. There is powder at the bottom, but remember we talked about that little spout where you can put cold or hot water. So of course the recipe on this one says cold water, 250 milliliters, and you mix it for 1 minute and then you have a drink. That hole will hold a special straw. And when you make your drink bag, you're going to put a straw in. Now, let's think about microgravity and thinking about things floating in space. Once you put that straw in, what's going to happen to the liquid? It's going to come out. And so there's a special clip. I used to have a straw and a clip, but somebody walked off with it one year. But you have a paper clip to help use a clip to keep your drink from floating away in space. This is actually peach apricot drink. And then I also have some lemonade in here. And you would add the same amount of water and shake and mix it up. Now, soda. I love some Coke or Pepsi. And the astronauts missed having soda in space. So Pepsi and Coca-Cola decided they were going to be the next Tang in space. And they created special drink machines for the space shuttle, and they created these special cans for the space shuttle. But think about when you open a can of soda on Earth and you pop the top, what happens? You're right. You hear the gas. The gas coming out of the bubbles. The carbon dioxide is being released from that can. Well, when you open a can of soda in space, because of the microgravity environment, the densities don't matter, and that gas doesn't release. So when you drink that Coke or Pepsi, you drink all of that gas. And even here on Earth, when the gas has been released, when we open it, it still makes us burp. Well, think about drinking that Coke and having all that gas in your stomach, what that would make you feel like. And it's actually very hard for astronauts to burp in space because of the microgravity environment. So you just drank all that gas and you can't burp, you would feel pretty miserable. So the astronauts, the scientists, and the doctors all decided that there would not be soda in space anymore. So astronauts can drink all these different juices. They can drink water. They can have coffee. You would just put hot water in here. They can have hot tea or ice cold tea and so forth. So that is what astronauts drink in space. So I hope you enjoy the Tang that you got with your blast pack, and have fun and pretend like you're floating around while you're drinking that Tang in space. Now, I mentioned the word microgravity. Microgravity is what the astronauts experience when they are orbiting the Earth. So a lot of times people will say, you're weightless when you're in space. Well, you're not, because there's still just a little bit of gravity, but there's not enough gravity to pull you down, so you're floating around. And Earth's gravity is still working on you, and eventually it would pull the space shuttle and the space station out of orbit. But microgravity can cause a lot of problems because it's just very different than life here on Earth. And one of the main things is that food is packaged like this to prevent crumbs and liquids from getting out and damaging the equipment or even being inhaled. Even pepper on the space station is in liquid form, because if you just shook some pepper and it went everywhere, everybody would be sneezing and people probably would not be very happy with you. So you have an experiment in your blast pack to do, compare bread versus tortillas. And one of the main reasons they use tortillas instead of bread is because of the crumb issue. But you are also going to learn in your experiment that maybe there's a difference in how long a tortilla might last, freshness-wise, compared to a slice of bread. Let's see. I've got a couple other things in here. Oh, I forgot about the pudding pack. The pudding pack is a thermostabilized food, and a pudding pack can just go to space like this. You just open it up, get your spoon, and eat that pudding pack. We've got some granola in here, and with raisins. And so again, it's got some dried milk in it also, so you would just add water to that. We've got cornbread dressing. That's probably, might have been taken up around Thanksgiving time. That's a pretty popular drink. And then we've got chicken teriyaki. So lots of different foods in here. So very similar to what we eat here on Earth, but yet very different. Notice one thing that's missing is pizza. You don't get much pizza on the space station. So it is time for you to get started with your experiments. Make sure you join us tomorrow at 2 o'clock for our Zoom call. We want to hear all about what you have done so far with your blast pack. And I am really curious to know who likes the astronaut ice cream that we included. Now, do you think the astronauts really eat this ice cream in space? Check out your data log and you'll find out some answers to that question. But I hope you enjoy your freeze-dried ice cream. Also, make sure your adult has received the email with the Zoom link. We hope that you are joining us the rest of this month when Commander Jennifer does Blast Pack's Super Science and Exciting Engineering. Good luck on your experiments. This is Commander Melissa, over and out.
Here's a bonus question for you. What do you think the astronaut's favorite food is? You're right, it's shrimp cocktail. And that's because it's spicy and they can taste it better in space.